All right, so today we're in chapter 4 of Paul's letter to the Colossians, and it's not nearly as dense as chapter 3, but there's some interesting stuff happening here. So here we go, all right? We jump right into it. Now, the first verse in chapter 4 really feels like it belongs in chapter 3. Depending on what version you have, mine actually includes that sentence like up in the chapter 3 section, if you could see it right there. And it's really because it is in that section. When he's talking about specific roles in the household, this is one of the roles that he's addressing, the first verse in chapter 4. Now, what that should tell you, one, is it's just a good, helpful reminder that the chapter numbers and the verses, they're arbitrary. Paul did not put them there. Somebody on riding a horse somewhere in the middle of, I don't know where, just picked it. So there was no meeting. They're there. They don't carry any weight. So don't use those as official authoritative designations. But it is good, I guess, for reference. Now, in that section, at the end of chapter 3, it's very, very, very similar to Ephesians chapter 5. There are roles in the household. They do mention slaves and masters. Now, slavery is not a good thing, but it is not the same thing as slavery in American history. This is slavery in the Roman Empire. A large percentage of the population in the Roman Empire were slaves. And often you could sell yourself into slavery. You could go into slavery because of a debt. It was a very different thing. It wasn't a good thing, but it was a very different thing. And so Paul is recognizing that this is a reality of life here in the Roman Empire, and he's telling them how they can live under the umbrella of a follower of Jesus in these less than ideal circumstances. And so he addresses masters. Provide for your slaves what is right and fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow in the little extra bonus video, okay? Come back to that. Then he gets to verse 2. There's a section here, verse 2 through 6. I love this. I love this section. So much of what we do as a church is within this section. He says, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, okay? When you pray, it's not just like a spiritual jog, right, that you're just doing so you can check off with no destination. We could pray for a lot of different reasons, but what I love here is he's like, pray and watch what happens and be thankful when what you asked for happens. It's amazing. It's amazing. If you think of the last time you prayed and I were to ask you, did God answer that prayer? Sometimes our prayers are so vague that we don't even know if God ended up answering them or not. This was a big thing for me when I was in college. I actually started writing down things I'm praying for, like specific things that I need or want even, and seeing, okay, is God going to answer these prayers? If you try that, your mind might be blown, because we often just pray things like we throw them up there, see if anything happens, and then God comes through for us, and we're not being watchful, and so we don't see the connection. You might want to try that, all right? Maybe try for a month, 2 months, pray for something and write it down. I draw a column right in the middle. I still do this sometimes, not all the time, but I draw a column right in the middle and see if God comes through, like if the prayer is answered in how I thought, how I didn't think, whatever. I'll write on the other side with the date that it happens. Pretty cool exercise, okay? Devote yourselves to prayer. Make it the first thing, not the last thing, right? It's a first response, not a last resort. And pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message. He's saying, give us that we'll have an opportunity to explain to people how good God is, that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I'm in chains. He says, pray that I may proclaim it clearly, that people will understand what I'm saying. Love that. And be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity with outsiders. Let your conversation always be full of grace and seasoned with salt. It should taste good. So that you may know how to answer everyone. I love this. I love this. He's like, pray that my words will be clear and that the message will be full of grace, appealing, and make the most out of every opportunity. If you're with us for our culture and leadership class, we just spent 2 weeks talking about how as a church, we try to make the most of every opportunity for people who are on the outside, for people who don't go to church. This is a big part of what we do here, all right? Then at the very end, you see, again, the reality that this is a letter. And it's kind of cool if you read it closely. Don't just skip it and be like, okay, it's over here. He says, Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. Tychicus is also delivering the letter to the church in Ephesus. Remember that. And he's got a third letter. He's a dear brother, a faithful minister, a fellow servant in the Lord. He says, I'm sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. He's the messenger, which means he's probably going to read it to the church. These words are probably coming out of his mouth to the church in this city. He says, he's coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother, who's one of you. They will tell you everything that's happening here, okay? Onesimus, remember that name for tomorrow. It's a big deal, Onesimus. My fellow prisoner, Aristarchus, sends you his greeting, as does my cousin Barnabas. Barnabas was one of Paul's mentors. As does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Mark is probably the guy who was tight with Peter, who traveled with Paul, like the Gospel Mark. This might be that Mark. And Barnabas was the cousin of Mark, but he was also Paul's mentor. He showed Paul how to do what he does. Then he mentions this other guy called, he says Jesus, who's called Justus. This is kind of cool. There's another Jesus in there. Jesus is actually the Hebrew name Joshua, so it's a pretty common name. But he goes by Justus, probably so he's not confused with the Jesus. And he mentions that they're Jews, they're other workers. He mentions Epaphras. Epaphras is the guy who started that church, along with the church in Laodicea and Hierapolis. He talks about how Epaphras is always praying for them. Epaphras is probably in the room when this is being read. And so it's Paul, big shot Paul, who met Jesus and started all these churches, giving Epaphras his stamp of approval. And so then he says, after this letter has been read to you, see to it that's also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you, in turn, read the letter from Laodicea. Now, this is speculation. It really doesn't matter all that much, but some people think that the letter in Laodicea is the book of Ephesians. Might be, might not be. Doesn't matter. I'm not totally sure if it matters, but kind of a fun little fact there. And then he gives this urge to a guy named Archippus. I don't know. Little tip I learned in school: when you don't know how to say the word, just say it confidently and fast, and people will think you're saying it right. So it blew that opportunity. But anyway, so that's the end of the letter. And once again, we get a visual, a picture of how they interacted, how the leaders cared about the people, how the people wanted to hear from the leaders, how this community was one and they loved each other. But remember the name Onesimus. So that's the end of Colossians. We're doing another one tomorrow, and it's part of this, but it's not in this book. See you then.